First of all, let me apologize for the delay in starting this function. We have with us today Dr. Felix. He has been visiting this month the Vishwarathi University, the Department of Economics, and he will leave by the end of this month. He has been at IRMA and has been Professor of Rural Management at the Indian Institute of Health Management Research. He is a product of Oxford University Social Anthropology as well as the Delhi School of Economics Sociology Department. He is the author of 3 books which are all on display outside the auditorium. The first book is Sacrificing People, Invasion of a Tribal Landscape. The second one is Out of This Earth, East India Adivasis and Aluminium Cartel. This is the book that he was working on when he visited ISI 4 years ago, and shortly afterwards the book came out. And the third one that has come out more recently, it's called Ecology Economy, Quest for a Socially Informed Connection. So his talk today will be based mostly on that topic, the third one. I know Dr. Felix as someone who doesn't just theorize. He has based his findings on first-hand information. He has spent many years with the people that he writes about, and many years with them, and he has learned from their livelihood and found some, whatever he has learned from there, whatever knowledge he has gathered from there, that is quite vivid in his writings as well as in his speeches. So without further delay, I would like to invite Dr. Pedal to start today's lecture. The format of this lecture will be, you will speak for about 40 minutes, and after that there will be questions and answers, following which he will recite his violin for about 10 minutes. Dr. Pedal.
Thank you so much, Adivasi. I feel immensely honoured actually to be here, and I extend my warmest greetings to all of you distinguished friends here, and thank you for coming to listen today. The subject that I gave for today's talk, as Devashish remembered, last time I was speaking here, the subject was aluminium economics, meaning the economics of the mining industry. And I think if I remember that day, I certainly was often presenting PowerPoint presentations full of facts and figures about the different aspects of the economics of the mining industry. But the subject today is Adivasi economics, past and present. And the second chapter of this recent book, Ecology Economy, we called it Adivasi economics. So what does it mean, Adivasi economics? In some ways, economics as it's usually understood, and Adivasi society and the present situation of Adivasis, which I'm sure you all know is in a very grave crisis at the moment. They're like 2 ends of a spectrum. It seems very hard to bring them together. But the name comes partly from an American anthropologist called Salins, who wrote a book called Stone Age Economics. And his argument then is that we think of the so-called most primitive societies, which are known as hunter-gatherers, such as the Andaman Islanders or the Australian Aborigines, as we think of them as primitive, we think of them as underdeveloped. And in a way, when you know more about these societies, nothing could be further from the truth. And one example that economists often give is that they say, in primitive times when we were hunting, the whole of life was taken up by a struggle for existence, and we had no time, humans had no time for their leisure activities. And this, again, if you know about tribal societies and you know about hunter-gatherers, is the most complete nonsense you could possibly imagine, because if you look at tribal societies, one area where they're very, very highly developed is in the arts of leisure, of song, of dance, even of the art of romance. But certainly early ethnographers and quite sensitive ones like W.G. Archer and Elwyn and many others collected huge volumes just of poetry, and that's not just poetry, any old poetry. It's often composed there and then in the moment by Adivasis, Orans, Santals, Gons, and of all the tribes actually. And the dances are so complex that there are literally hundreds and hundreds of different drum beats and songs, a huge repertoire. And if you look at hunter-gatherer societies, even more, what Salins is saying in his book, Stone Age Economics, is that actually the hunter-gatherers spent relatively very little time getting food. They gathered from the forest often, they hunted often, and it was very strenuous, very hard work. But they had much, much more time for leisure, and they had enormous arts. They were not, as Adivasis are not, they don't look to some stars to entertain them from the media. They are their own stars, and they are their own centres of cultural existence in that way. So one of the things that I'm saying here today is that in many ways the idea of tribal people as primitive or backward or even underdeveloped is a monstrous distortion that is blind to their own directions of development. It's very easy to see the ways where mainstream society is more developed than them, obviously in technology. And for example in literacy. But there are so many areas where actually they are much more highly developed than us. One is obviously in this arts of entertainment, dance, leisure activities. Another is very important, the aspect of sustainability, of really what do we mean by sustainability. And if you look at the Adivasi cultures and communities of the country, these are communities that have sustained themselves in their environment without basically damaging or destroying their environment. And this has changed recently for reasons we can go into. But they've done that for at least 2,000 years. The tribe that I have spent a lot of my life looking at is the Kons in Orissa, and their name for themselves is Kubinga. And they're almost certainly the same people as the Kalinga. And as you probably know, Indian written history starts with Ashoka's great sort of mea culpa, saying in the Kalinga War, my armies killed about 100,000 people. About 100,000 people died in the Kalinga War. About 150,000 people were enslaved, and many times those numbers died in the famine and disease after the war. That is because he inscribed it himself, for whatever reasons. The facts of the Kalinga War stand almost at the threshold of Indian history, and in many ways what we are seeing now is a kind of repetition that I hope will become a bit clearer in the course of this lecture, and is also, I hope, clearer in my writings that are outside and in many other forms. So, in a way, what is being destroyed here is, if you look at the population of Adivasis might be given, and the classifications, as you know, are very, very complex and contested. So, say there are 80 or 90 million Adivasis, or scheduled tribal people in the country. Approximately a quarter of them have been displaced in the name of development, because 40 or 50 million people have been displaced by big dams and other so-called development projects since independence, and of them about 40% are tribal. So if you do the figures, at least about a quarter of the Adivasi population has already been displaced. And maybe another quarter are already under threat of displacement. Even the Land Acquisition Act, which is a significant landmark questioning the 1894 British-era eminent domain Land Acquisition Act, even that has so many loopholes, or is so many acts such as the SEZ Act and the Coal-Bearing Land Act and many others are excluded from it, that it may not make very much difference. So what you have around the country is a very large number of movements, Adivasi movements as well as non-Adivasi movements, against forced displacement, that some people call development-induced displacement, but because many of the people being displaced very strongly dispute whether these projects constitute development at all. Certainly for them, they would say the line of development is cut off. But what you can say for certain is this is investment-induced displacement, because what is beyond argument is all of these big development projects are being motivated to a large extent by very large sums of often foreign investment that are coming in for big dams as well as for metal projects and other big so-called development projects. So if you're looking at understanding the Adivasi economics, what is the economic system of the tribal people, you see a situation of absolutely momentous change, where the original system that was there until 30 years ago, when I used to walk in South Chhattisgarh and there was no threat of Naxalites or Maoists, or the vast conflict that is now there was not there. A system was still in place that is now very much more undermined. But of course, this undermining began, or the pace of it very much accelerated during British rule in India. That when you had the Battle of Plassey here in West Bengal, and you had the East India Company forming a government, turning from a trading partner into the government of India, you had unquestionably a loot going on in the country. And actually, that loot, if you like, it was condoned by the East India Company directors, but I would say it was not condoned by the British people. And in fact, Clive, I don't know how many of you know this, when he went back to England after he had been the supreme commander here and won all his victories, he was not a national hero. He was absolutely hated by the English public, to the extent that when he died, he actually committed suicide by cutting his throat. Just 6 people went to his funeral. And when he was impeached, and Warren Hastings also, they were exonerated in public, but the public knew that they were guilty for that loot. It was common knowledge that Bengal had been looted. So I say this because, on the one hand, what was happening economically at that time was very significant, that you had Adam Smith around at that time, and he is known as the father of economics, but he was not an admirer of corporations. In fact, he detested the East India Company in particular, and distrusted all corporations in general. So that when he talked about because just before in the 1720s, what was called the South Sea Bubble had happened, when the South Sea Company was and one of the other world's first corporations, like the East India Company, it actually dealt in trading slaves from Africa to Latin America. That was what it did at first. But in 1720, it took on Britain's national debt. It took on half of it, and the national debt had got very big after long wars in France and Spain that Britain had been doing. Very often wars increased the level of national debt, obviously. So it took on the national debt and it started selling shares in the national debt, and it created the world's first infamous bubble, known as the South Sea bubble, which crashed and thousands of investors lost all their money. And I don't know how many of you know, but in books on the East India Company, in the 1760s, another bubble happened called the Bengal bubble. And that was the same thing. After the Battle of Plassey and Buxar, the shares in the East India Company became very, very popular, and massive amount of gold was looted from West Bengal, from the whole of Bengal probably, and then it crashed in the same way. But another aspect, another reason for mentioning this is that it's usually assumed that societies always, the line of development is a single line of development or evolution. And when Darwin's theories were applied to societies by Herbert Spencer, who coined the term survival of the fittest, it wasn't Darwin's term, and by Marx and Engels, what Darwin had been talking about was thousands of lines of development of different species, all going on at the same time, in relationship, with human beings just as part of the picture. And in a way he was challenging the Christian idea of nature is there for man to enjoy and dominate and exploit. And he was showing that man is actually related to all the other species. But when the idea of evolution was applied to society, both Marx and Engels, in a way, and Herbert Spencer, they applied it in a monolithic way, as if there is only one line of development, as if we all go or have gone from hunter-gatherers to primitive communism, to slave-owning societies, to feudalism, to capitalism, and then if we are good socialists, maybe we'll manage to progress to some kind of proper socialism. But this is not, the facts of history do not support this. And if you look at what happened in Bengal, there are many ways in which Indian society of that time, for all its, if you like, corruption under the Mughals and other forms of power, very feudal, obviously, but there are many aspects which were much more highly developed than British or European society. And one aspect that's very obvious is it was much more multicultural. This is a concept today that Europe likes to think it's an expert in, but India of that 18th century was truly multicultural. You had all these different religions alongside each other, and in Britain of that period, only if you were Church of England could you hold senior office. Roman Catholics weren't allowed to, nor Jews, nor Quakers, nor let alone Hindus, Muslims. You had to be Church of England to hold senior office. And it's not that long before that witches had been burnt at the stake. And it was the Protestant Catholic Wars. It was a very, very intolerant society in certain ways. Another way that India was more highly developed than Britain at that time was in manufacturing. The quality of cloth, the quality of metalwork of that time was, as it were, a line of development that was cut off by the British invasion and conquest. And I remember one aspect being coins. This was shown to be by an Indian banker who made his own private collection of coins, that the quality of coins up and before the British was very high workmanship. The quality after was much more machine-made, regular, standardized, but the craftsmanship had gone. And obviously in terms of cloth, I mean, India was leading the world in the quality, immense quality of cloth. That is, I mean, it's still there to some extent, but the incredibly fine quality that was admired by the whole world at that time is just a memory, as it were. And there's still manufacturing industries that carry it on in different ways, but against great pressure from the multinationals, you could say, or the factory-made cloth, even now. So this is in many ways similar to the way that mainstream society now believes itself superior to tribal societies, that tribal societies are very highly developed. For example, in I mentioned sustainability, and one aspect of that is that the economy, in writing this book, ecology, economy, these two words, they come from the ancient Greek words oikos, meaning house, and nomos, meaning law, and logos, meaning logic. So economia means really the laws of correct housekeeping. Ecologia means, as it were, the logic of correct housekeeping. The two words should mean almost the same thing and should be completely coordinated, instead of which they are at such, they're so uncoordinated that what this book starts with is, while Jairam Ramesh was Environment Minister, he wrote an article that is quite insightful in EPW, which I'm sure some of you have read, where he talks about two realities that are not in dialogue, that for every decision he made as an Environment Minister, he has two different lobbies breathing down his neck, or probably more than two, but one is from the business community and one is from the environmentalists, and of course the social activists. And what he notices is that there is no dialogue at all between these two, if you like, between the economists on the one side and the environmentalists on the other. And he's writing the article, in a way it's a plea for some kind of dialogue, and in a way that's where I place my work at the moment too, that if you look at the dialogue from the side of the environmentalists and the social activists, if you like, they are often more coherent in the arguments they're giving, but as is often said, money speaks louder than words, and very often the investment is speaking much louder than the or the arguments given by the different sides. If you look at the debates on big dams, on the nuclear industry, on many other mining industries and so on, this to me is very, very clear that in terms of the debate, the environmentalists and social activists are winning it hands down, but there isn't that much debate because money is counted as a more important value. And this is where tribal society is such presents such a different reality, that until recently, money was not a particularly important part of the tribal system of values. What was really valued is, I remember one tribal elder from the Khon saying, "Where are the saints in your mainstream society? In this village, we are all saints. We live on very little. We share in the community everything we have. We waste absolutely nothing. We're all living like saints." And this is, in many ways, the tribal economy in this way is based on principles of ecology. Ecology may not be a concept they formulate. They're not into abstraction so much, but how they formulate it is above all in nigam, in restraints of... If you read the very detailed literature, you'll very often find, for example, the first time I ever went to an Adivasi village, it was a Santal village in Mayurbhanj district, and the house I was staying in, the man wanted to offer me some mokka, some maize, but he had it ripe in his own field, but he wasn't giving me, and I asked why, and he said, "Ame puja kolune." And that to me seemed like some superstition at that time. But the more I've learnt about it, the more it's a very regulated system that of not taking too much from nature, never taking before certain rituals have been done. So the whole tribal economy is punctuated by a large number of festivals, some of them around cultivated foods and some of them around uncultivated foods. And until that puja has been performed, for example, the wild foods are allowed to regenerate. So the first mangoes that fall, the seeds are allowed to form. The bamboo is never cut until it has flowered, and if you know about bamboo, it has very complex patterns of flowering that Adivasis understand. So there are many, many ways that this restraint towards nature, and this became even clearer to me when 3 months ago I was in New Zealand and invited by the New Zealand anthropologists to be one of the key speakers in their annual conference. And I was very moved to have many of the Maori elders and intellectuals, the Maori being, in a way, the indigenous people of the world who have got the most, attained the best status of any indigenous people worldwide, I would say. And one thing that I learned from them is the word taboo is a Polynesian Maori word, and it means sacred, basically. So when, in a way, in New Zealand, this is something that all New Zealanders learn. They will never go near the Maori land or Maori sacred places because they know it's absolutely taboo. But it's taboo because it's sacred. And this kind of sacredness in nature, I would say, is something as a species we need to learn in order to survive now. And we need to learn it above all from Adivasis. So when the Dongria have... one of the very special things about the Dongria Khons in the Niamgiri range is that they have a taboo on cutting trees on top of Niamgiri. They cut trees on the side of Niamgiri to make the shifting cultivation fields that then are allowed to go back to nature. But on the top, they never cut the trees there. So you have primary forest right at the top of Niamgiri, exactly where Vedanta wants to mine its bauxite. And I told a few of you who came in small number just now this story, so forgive the repetition, but one of the ways, in a way, the Adivasi economics is based on a very holistic form of knowledge. And because it's holistic, they understand things that are missed by often our very, very senior scientists. So, actually, the forest at the top of Niamgiri, so far Vedanta has been prevented from mining there, and this is not much known, but one of the first people who staked his life on defending that forest was the DFO of Waikato district, who told me he was offered enormous bribes and given death threats to give clearance for forest clearance for mining that area on the top of Niamgiri, and he refused. Because he understood what very few scientists seem to understand, that where you have a bauxite deposit at the top of a mountain, it acts as a sponge at the top of the mountain, that when the monsoon rain falls, the bauxite merges with the H2O, with the water. The aluminium, this is one of its qualities, it mixes with other elements, which is also why it becomes such a key element for the aerospace industry, for all those complex alloys. But at the top of the mountain, it's mixing with H2O, and it's holding the water, so you have the perennial streams from the mountain. And the Dongria understand that when they say, in fact, even back in the 1940 census, Gopinath Mohanty, the great writer of Orissa, mentioned a story where a census official was going to the Dongria and saying, "Tumro dharma kono, what is your religion?"